Friday, June 2nd, 2023 Land Use Committee meeting. We are going to get started with update on the ADU handbook. I am then going to take a little bit out of order in our agenda and move up to item 3 after the ADU handbook, and then take up the density after that. So I will turn it over to Howard, who's going to share the screen with the Zoom folks, and let him do his presentation.
All right, thank you.
It's update on the city-owned property assessment.
Where's this? I work on anybody want? I thought it was going to be where I have my notes on the side. Yeah, so this isn't the PDF we did.
Somebody's got to try it.
All right.
Passing around the spoon. Thank you. Softer crack now, stayed up all
All
night.
right. Well, I apologize. Yeah. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to be giving a brief update on progress on the ADU, and the reason and timing for this is the fact of how the ADU zoning has just been passed, and now this is the structure that the ADU handbook is going to follow. So let me zoom out a little bit on this. There we go. With the ADU handbook, there's purpose and there's an intent to it, and there's a slight difference between those two. So I will be helping you understand some planning language during this presentation. The purpose of the ADU handbook is that we want to assist homeowners and contractors in the process of creating an ADU in the city of Portsmouth. We want to make sure that the homeowners and contractors understand the relevant zoning, the design standards, and the building codes that they need to know in order to create an ADU handbook. The intent of the handbook is to promote the design and construction of a low-density, affordable housing option that accurately reflects the character and uniqueness of Portsmouth. We want to make sure our homeowners are informed and can make a well-educated decision about whether or not they want to or can create an ADU on their property, and lead them through the process of doing that. The ADU handbook is going to have 5 categories in sections, and we're going to focus today really on the first 3, with our primary focus being on planning and designing your ADU. But the structure right now, as you can see up on the screen, the table of contents, we're going to introduce an ADU. We're going to help the homeowner and contractor plan and design an ADU. And then the secondary sections are, if they have frequently asked questions, that this section will help inform them about answers before they start reaching out to the planning office. So the section of the ADU handbook, getting started, we're going to clearly define what an ADU handbook, in the ADU handbook, what a dwelling unit is, why it should be created, and the many types of these accessory dwelling units. So the handbook breaks down the ADU into 2 categories, an attached and a detached, and this falls along with the recently approved zoning ordinance. Up on the screen, bulleted points are the sections of what is to be considered in an AADU that is directly taken out of the zoning ordinance. So with these 2 categories, there's 4 types that we're going to outline and clearly define and go to detail with in terms of an attached ADU. So as we've been discussing during this and during other meetings about what an ADU is, you've heard about an internal conversion. And up on the screen, this isn't in Portsmouth. I didn't choose any houses that were in Portsmouth. So the idea of an internal conversion, graphically represented in the picture, is that there's a home with an existing wing, that this space could be converted over into an ADU, or somewhere in the basement could be converted over into an ADU. The second of the 4 types is a garage conversion. So here we have the garage, it's attached, and at some point, historically, this looks like it was once a carriage house, but it was converted into a garage and attached. The idea is that this space could be converted over into an ADU. So the third type is an outward extension, and here you can see this purposes for this discussion right here was an existing home, and they built outwards. It could be to the side, it could be to the back. Up on the bulleted points, you can see the different parameters of what is to be done according to the zoning ordinance about an outward extension. So these are not in great detail as it is in the zoning ordinance. The fourth type is an upward extension, and here you can see the height 75% of the existing structure. This is an example that there would be an existing garage that was forward of the house, but a certain amount is allowed to extend up to 75% of the height of the existing structure. So the second category is a DADU, or detached. Here, it becomes a lot more complex. Outside of the building envelope that exists, there's going to be an accessory building on the lot that's either existing or is going to be created. And the zoning ordinance goes to a lot greater detail of what can be done in either an existing or building that is created. I won't go into reading every single one of these, but you can see there's a lot of thought that needs to go into how a homeowner or a contractor convert or create a detached ADU. We want to make sure that that structure is carried through in the handbook. So with this second category, there's also 4 types the handbook is going to be organizing an ADU into. The barn that you see up here is the first category, and these are expected to be a little bit more of the outlining categories of neighborhood in Portsmouth. The idea is that this whole barn cannot be converted over to an ADU, but the zoning says that there's going to be a certain allowed square footage or gross living area that can be converted over.
Forgive me, Howard, I'm sorry to interrupt,
Yeah.
but it looks like there's somebody
Waiting.
in the
Oh, wants to be
in the
admitted.
waiting room.
Click admit.
No, thanks. So the second of the 4 types that we're considering is you start getting a little bit more into the denser areas of Portsmouth, and it's may have been a carriage house at some point that's been converted, or a newly created structure in the back of a property that looks like an old carriage house. Again, accordance to what the existing zoning will allow. Here's a detached ADU. The third type is a garage. So the picture here is meant to represent a detached garage with a potential expansion, so living space is created above. Fourth category is a lot smaller area. Here's an example of a shed. The ADU handbook needs to help the homeowner understand minimum sizes that they're going to be able to accomplish a living space according to building code and not only the zoning code. So with that education in the front end of the handbook, the next step is going to be planning and designing. The language is going to be more informal. Here's the title, Your ADU, as opposed to saying planning and designing an ADU. We want to make it much more relatable to a homeowner that comes in. There's going to be flow charts that help them understand what tasks need to be accomplished in each one of these sections. Plan, we want to make sure that they can go out and assess their property before they come in and speak with somebody informally in the planning department. And then after that, how they're going to design, what they need to consider in designing, how they're going to apply and permit it. And we also want to help them get some understanding of what's going to take to build. So under property assessment, we're going to provide in the handbook different forms for them to not only assess their property, but the character of their neighborhood, a form is going to be done in the appendix that's going to help them understand how they need to create a plot plan before they come in and speak with us, so they can understand where it can be located. The next thing we want to provide in the handbook is an understanding and a checklist for them to be able to put together a development team, help them understand what elevations, floor plans, and site plans are, and how much information they need to have before they come in and speak with the planning department. So we have gone out through the grant and retained 2 consultants to help us with this handbook, and that is going to be coming into play here, where we want to help visualize in the handbook so the homeowners can understand more graphically what is lined out in the zoning ordinance. We want them to understand what elevations are, what needs to be shown, and we want them to understand what floor plans are and what information they need to create on a plan before coming to speak with the planning department. We also want them to understand at what level they need to do an analysis of their lot when it comes to developing a site plan, with all these criteria needing to be met before they come in and meet with us, and they'll know what needs to be done in their permitting process. So then we want to outline for the homeowner or contractor how they're going to go through the process of permitting this ADU in the city. It's important also for them to understand at this point, the city is going to be looking at all these different elements as well as what's lined out in the zoning ordinance in terms of architectural design standards, massing, character, siding materials. We want to be able to see what this is going to look like when it gets constructed, to make sure that it meets the criteria and character of the neighborhood that they reside in. So as you recall from the zoning ordinance, there's 2 different types of permitting approval. There's administrative. It's all lined out in the table of uses, and we want to be able to have the homeowner understand if they conform to these different aspects of the zoning, then the planning director is going to be the one that can approve this ADU. We also want them to understand when they're in the permitting, they may not be able to meet all that criteria, so they'll need to go in for a conditional use permit. And here you can see the zoning ordinance is all the criteria that would be required. So after we help this homeowner or contractor go through all these different steps, we want to give them information that's not necessarily anything more than advisory. There's recommendations, suggestions about who they need to engage and why. So when they get into the phase of construction, they have a clear understanding that they have either the capacity to project manage themselves, or they want to retain somebody to help project manage the development. It could be the contractor, it could be the architect, but all the different steps that they're going to need to go through. So that is, so far, an update on the ADU. And I put in density incentives because I thought Peter was going to go next. But after I take questions, then it's going to be moved over to the Housing Authority, correct?
Yes. Does anyone have any questions about that? Andrew?
That all seems very straightforward and streamlined, and that's really, really helpful for the people that don't necessarily play in this arena all the time and stare at these plans all day long. The supplemental aspect of that could be the why. So why is having relative character to your neighborhood important? Why is having a certain setback relevant? And why do I need to go through a whole architectural plan versus some people who just do simple drawings? And so that might be in your intent section, and that could be another component of it. But
Right.
I think just explaining to people the why of some of these things might help them grasp the bigger picture. I know that certainly helps me when trying to understand something I may not be as familiar with. And
Right.
so that might be something to include as well.
Absolutely agree, and that is going to be included in the beginning, right up front. So we're going to describe and define what an ADU is, but why create it?
Sorry, I guess I mean some of the considerations or stipulations that people may face when trying to create one.
Like why subordinate?
Y
Right, and
similar.
that's all going to be written into
Okay.
the front end section, so they have the much broader view of what this is.
100%.
With the detail of what you're saying. I agree with you. It'll be in there.
Any other questions?
Howard, is this going to be online and hard copy, or just online, or how do you get into that stage?
Once it's established, the idea is that it would be uploaded, and that we'll start exploring what the planning website part is, and creating a separate section where they can get all this information. And so the idea is that you can print this out. It's going to be many pages. You'll be able to print out all of it or not. You'll be able to download it. But there's also an idea that it'll be an interactive PDF, so that you'll be able to click and jump to different spots to be able to move to an area faster, because even though it's a handbook, it is going to be comprehensive. So the intention is to have it dimensional aspect to it, either online, downloaded, or just interacting on the website.
And for the part about being sure what is coming into a neighborhood, will it be a set of pre-approved plans, or a set of, will it be a simple process, especially for the administrative review, where a homeowner could get this done without necessarily having to engage an architect and just pick a certain pattern from a pattern book, or how might that work?
It's not intended to have templates that they can then bring in and say, I'd like to build this at my house. There's such diversity and different character around Portsmouth. We
Of
can't
course.
really consider all the different variables.
But if somebody, say, pulled a plan, a prepackaged plan online and said, this is what I want to do, that might be good enough.
It might be, as long as it meets
Right.
the
It has to
architectural
conform. It has to
character. It
conform.
can't just be a modern going on to it.
And just to add to that, I think that's clearly the intention, so somebody would just have to swap out the skin of the building if they had a different architectural style, but the floor plans and the elevation should work, minus the architectural shift. Yeah, that's the intent.
And just want to, who are the consultants you engaged?
Brendan McNamara doing the architectural elevations and the floor plans, and Rob Leanne is going to do the rendering, and Howard's going to do the site plans.
Thank you.
The two consultants are, one's an architect that is in Maine, and the other is the illustrator who's in northern Massachusetts, so they are local or regional. So they understand
Everybody's
the
local
vernacular of
online.
the area.
Most importantly, they're good.
Any other questions?
Less a question, more a comment, but on top of having those consultants,
Talk into your microphone.
it might be beneficial to go to the same recurring architects that we generally see in the city. I think on the planning board, we see a wide range of them in the city, but at the same time, we see them all frequently. So going to them and saying, here's our handbook, here's how we can educate you on this, because sometimes the resident might not have their plans entirely baked out yet, so they may approach an architect, and the architect could say, hey, let me reference this handbook, and then save us all a lot of time. And so consulting with them and just familiarizing them with that process.
Okay.
You have to abide by the setbacks, existing setbacks. How about lot coverage? Do you have to keep within the same lot coverage?
You have to keep within whatever the requirement is for the
Right.
district you're in, yes. There's
Which,
no zoning relief.
in town, it's going to be hard to do if, there's a lot of houses are non-conforming anyway. So if you're trying to expand your little house on your little lot,
There are probably many
Portsmouth.
that will not be able to use it, but there are 10 people that will be able to use it as a result of the amendments.
And that would be for creating a new structure, existing structures or an existing
yeah,
single
if
family.
you were just going to carve out part of your house.
Or use an existing building.
Yeah.
You might also just add in, to help homeowners, an estimated time for each type of process, while they're trying to choose which route they would like to pursue. An administrative review could take a lot less than some other routes might take.
Right, right.
Any other questions?
It's still expensive for people to do it.
I do have a question.
We'll take public comment at the end. Sorry. If there's no other discussion, we'll move on to the next item in our agenda, which we've moved up to item 3, update on the city-owned property assessment. And the city council has tasked us with, we found the 4 properties that were sort of identified as being the most promising as far as development goes. They then asked us to prioritize those and to get feedback from the Portsmouth Housing Authority regarding those specific properties and their thoughts on it. In addition, it's been asked if the Portsmouth Housing Authority had ever looked at any redevelopment of their current owned properties. So I will begin by, let's get some feedback from the Portsmouth Housing Authority on their thoughts, and then we can talk about the prioritizing. Yeah?
One quick question, and I mentioned this to Craig earlier this morning. If you could just explain what the Portsmouth Housing Authority is, and I think there's more than one Portsmouth Housing Authority entity, because I have some confusion about that. I think other people have some confusion, just so that it's, just explain it.
Sure. Yep. Thank you. My name's Craig Welch. I'm the Executive Director of the Portsmouth Housing Authority, and per Rick's comment, also our affiliated nonprofit, which is called PHA Housing Development Limited. We're often referred to as Portsmouth Housing or PHA. And like Councilor Moreau said, we were asked to speak to 2 questions. One, the 4 parcels that the city has now identified as potential for workforce housing development, and then also the 12 properties that we own and manage, and whether or not there's redevelopment opportunities like we did downtown with Ruth Lou and Griffin Place when we owned that parking lot. So that's one reason why we had looked at that first. I want to introduce my colleague, Adam Rudig. Adam's the president of our PHA Housing Development Limited Board, and is a total pleasure to work with. Adam doesn't need to be introduced this way, but I will say that Adam has a master's degree in architecture from Yale. I only say that because that's indicative of the kind of people that we have on our boards and commissions. We've really made an effort to attract people with a lot of expertise in land use and construction and design. So I'm gonna go over to the computer and just so we can have some visuals of the sites that we're doing, and maybe Adam, if you could speak quickly to the kind of criteria as we're thinking about new development, the kind of criteria that we're considering.
Sure. Hi, I'm Adam Rudig, as Craig introduced me, and I'm the president of what we call the Limited Board, which is the portion of the organization which focuses on the development of new housing. You've asked a little bit about how we analyze various properties, and I think that question is going to come up as we look at the 4 properties that you've highlighted in addition to our other properties. This comes from a report that we've been working on, and there are a couple of areas that we've highlighted in this report which show somewhat in order of importance what we look at when we're evaluating whether or not a particular property is a good development option for us. And before I get into these, I think it's important to note that to some degree, this list and the order of this list is influenced by the urgency of the housing crisis in Portsmouth. So the first item on the list is economies of scale. And so what we're looking at is whether or not the site would allow us to build enough housing so that, first of all, we would qualify for the type of tax credit financing that we have to use in order to be able to make these developments affordable to us and to the potential residents. And, that I think that's really the main issue that we're going to be talking about. So as we look at all the various sites around Portsmouth, the 4 on your list are sites, I think the first thing we look at is whether or not it's possible to build a project there that has enough units so that it's going to work with the economics and the other issues. Another one down the list is neighborhood context. So that's a broad category. One component of that is how does the site work, just in terms of the shape of the site, its access to roads and other resources that we think it's important for the residents to have. Another component of that is that an appropriate use? Is it a residential neighborhood? Is the scale of this project going to be appropriate in that location? Is introducing residents to this neighborhood going to be something that's an appropriate fit? So we look at that very closely. There are a million ways to look at that, but that's important on the list. Next down the list, cultural and historic preservation. So, for our project at Ruth's Place, we were able to work out a angle for the development that preserved an historic house in downtown Portsmouth. We've had discussions about the Sherburne site and an existing historic building that's there. When you're working in Portsmouth on these types of projects, it's going to come up all the time, and it's important to us that we act in a way that's sensitive to historic properties. And so that has to be something that's possible when we consider various parcels. Environmental conditions, of course, this is, I think, true of anybody looking at development in any town, but we have to make sure that this is something that's appropriate from an environmental consideration. Traffic studies, this is always a hot topic and will continue to be, but we take that very seriously. We look very closely at traffic impact, and we try to view that in a scientific way, which is important. Sustainable development opportunities. Ruth's Place was LEED Gold, was it? LEED Gold, which is a very high standard. This is something that's been a particular mission of Craig's, but is there an opportunity to be able to do that kind of work? That's something that we look at. But I'll stop there. That's really the top of the list. Does that answer your question?
It begins to. Does anyone on the committee have questions?
My question wasn't really answered. I understand there's two entities, but they're private entities. They're not city entities. These are private corporations that produce affordable housing. Is that?
So the Portsmouth Housing Authority was founded in 1953. We're celebrating our 70th anniversary. That was enabled by state statute, and that was a result of some federal policy and funding for the public housing program. During when we developed Gosling in 1959, and during our first 14 years, we used those federal funds as we were directed to by that state statute to produce the first 421 units of housing, the public housing, Woodbury Manor, State Street, Pleasant Street, Feaster, Margison, and Gosling. Those are all the oldest ones. Public housing went away, and I should back up and say the PHA was created. It was an enabling state statute, but it was created by the city of Portsmouth. So the city of Portsmouth is a resolution in the city of Portsmouth back in 1953 that created the Portsmouth Housing Authority and called for the mayor and council appointing a 6-member board of commissioners. So that's what the mayor and previous mayors have done for us. Back in, I can't remember the specific date, in the 80s, when the federal low-income housing tax credit program started up, between 1973, we didn't build anything between 1973 and 1996, but back in the 80s, this new financial tool, the federal low-income housing tax credit program, was created. And then in order for us to develop properties using that financial tool, we needed to have an entity that was able to be the general partner in these limited partnerships. So try to simply explain that all of the properties that we built from 1996 till now are separate limited partnerships, of which the PHA Housing Development Limited is the general and controlling partner. So we own it. They're all nonprofit owned. We've never sold anything. And so that's our mission, to continue to develop. But it was really just a function of how the tax credit law was written, is that the PHA couldn't encumber the kind of debt that is required in using those federal low-income housing tax credits. Initially, it was the same board, made PHA Housing Development Limited, and then it was the same people on the same board until the Attorney General's office says you can't do that. But there's 2 commissioners that are also appointed to the PHA Housing Development Limited Board, and then elect the other ones. So So that's the case, like with Connors Cottage, PHA Housing Development Limited is the general partner, and then there's always an investor who buys the tax credit that's a part of that partnership.
So it's a group of the construction activities being done by the limited, which Adam is president.
Right.
And so all the new things, it's not a city entity. It's the original 1953 organization has participation on the limited board. And in terms of the actual construction and investment, it's these outside investors plus the PHA
Right.
that make it happen, basically.
Right.
So,
Right. Yeah, those bylaws say to carry out the purposes of the Portsmouth Housing Authority, and that's what.
Is the city at all a part of the limited entity?
Well, to the extent that two of the members of the limited have been appointed by the mayor, then yes.
Well,
but otherwise,
the appointments by the mayor are the first group,
Right.
and then that group is also on the limited, but the mayor doesn't directly appoint to the limited, right?
the mayor does not directly appoint the limited. The PHA Board of Commissioners appoints the limited. Right.
Okay, thank you, and now I better understand it. Thank
Okay,
you.
all right. Okay, to speak to what Adam said about the criteria, and I can speak to both of these, how about at the same time, because 3 of the sites that the city has proposed are actually abutting our existing properties in one way or the other. So, in fact, let's start right here in our neighborhood, or where we are. Oops, sorry, if you don't mind. Is where we're sitting right now. So this is, this here is City Hall Complex, and this is what is called the Connors Cottage, the former Cottage Hospital. We, along with the city, worked with the city. The city actually owns this building, but we have a lease on the building. So we're the general partner, and there's Lafayette School is that same situation. This is 20 units of senior housing. We did an adaptive reuse on, saved that building, and did an adaptive reuse on in 2003 that turned that into 20 units of senior housing using the low-income housing tax credit program. So in terms of redevelopment opportunities, one of the sites that the city has identified, when you're talking about the lower lot, that's the lower lot, right? Is this particular lot. And I'll start by saying, too, that all 4 lots that the city has identified, we'd love to develop into workforce housing. That's our mission, and we would do that for any of the sites. One of the sites, I don't believe it's possible, but that's the abutting property. Up here, is there any redevelopment opportunity as a part or right abutting or an attachment to the Connors Cottage? I don't believe so. That building is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, but to build something new, then that would be possible. And again, how do I do this? When you're, one of the criteria that we're talking about is trying to maximize do something that's responsive to the crisis that we're in. The report, the housing needs report that we did for the city of Portsmouth show that that Portsmouth can support an additional 1,500 affordable housing units by the end of this decade. Right now, the PHA over our history is at about a clip of about 9 a year. So we're not going to get there going the speed that we are, even though we added 64 units. But for sure, we've lost that many affordable units in the amount of time that it took to do that. So as Adam said, the urgency for us to respond to the crisis in terms of how many units we can have and the impact on the community and how long it's going to take to do that are big criteria. We'll go to the first tax credit property that we did in 1996 was also a historic preservation of a school, the old neighborhood school at Atlantic Heights. This is Atlantic Heights Senior Housing. That's 30 units of senior housing, tax credit finance housing, permanently affordable housing. We own the land that includes this parking lot and this little chunk here in back. If you were to walk back here, you would find that you would probably agree that this site is more difficult to develop than the front part of the site, which is wide open and flat. But about half of this field here is owned by the city. So when the city put that on the list, when they talk city-owned property, it's not entirely city-owned property that makes that look, but it's being able to get this piece of land and develop something here. We've thought about that for a long time, and again, out of the 4 sites, I think that's a great opportunity to do that. When you're talking about, again, the criteria of building as many units as we can, or as many units that's appropriate for the neighborhood, and that 40-unit threshold that we talk about, and the impact on the neighborhood in terms of the residential abutters, I think you'll agree that, there's anything that we build here could be, 100 feet. I don't know what the setback is, but would be in the middle of what's an otherwise very dense neighborhood, with housing on all 4 sides and one way in and out on Kearsarge Road. It's actually the driveway is here, so it really doesn't go through all this neighborhood, but it's right here. But that's a reasonably, as I don't know if it's as small as the Junkins Avenue or otherwise. Another historic preservation project that we did in 2010, and is another school that is owned by the city that has a long-term land lease on, is the Lafayette School. Beautiful property. This is 10 units of senior housing. Are there redevelopment opportunities here? When this was originally being talked about a long time ago, and this took, I think, a decade of conversation, this building was going to have to come down because it was collapsing. And the original idea, I'm told, this was before my time, was the potential development of this site here. That's not being considered. As far as I know, there was a lot of objection to that. Again, with that playground, again, if you look at the criteria of impact on a neighborhood and the proximity of residential abutters, that's in a pretty tight spot as well, that's surrounded really closely by residential neighbors. Typically, when we're going through this construction, there's some disruption. After that, people think it's awesome. That was the case here, but that not on the list. That's the possibility there. 950. There were 3 properties, 3 of the public housing properties that were built between 1959 and around, not 59, 1963 to 65 or so. If you look around the building, you look around the city, you'll find the exact same design for these 3 smaller properties. This one's at 950 State Street. This is our State Street property. There's 3 buildings here comprising of 12 units. There's a 2-story building here, a 1-story building, and another 1-story building. Again, it's right in the middle of a dense residential neighborhood. We really don't think that there's, to redevelop this property. You could do it, but you're going to get a very small number of units. You have 12 now. How many are you really going to add at State Street? So I do not think that there's any redevelopment opportunity there.
Greg, can I just add one comment? Yep. Another thing to consider when we're talking about the redevelopment of existing properties is displacement of current residents, and that makes it harder.
It sure does.
That's an understatement.
That's an understatement, yeah, right. This, of course, is the smallest property we have. It's the same style you'll see as Pleasant Street and Woodbury Avenue. This is only 8 units. It's an unbelievable piece of property. It's on the South Mill Pond. Obviously, in a tight neighborhood, there's only 8 units. If we redeveloped that, how many more could we get? Maybe 0, maybe 2. And you've got a wetland asset here. So we don't think there's any substantial redevelopment opportunities that fit our criteria. All right. Sorry, fat fingers today. This is not something we built, but something we bought and renovated. This is Wamisit Place. It's a 100-unit family development that was built in, I don't know when it was built, but it underwent a $14 million renovation back in 2011. And am I in the right spot? Good question.
I know, I was trying to figure, you're the school right there.
Right.
You need to
You
go
wanted to go-
farther up,
Yeah,
going up.
You're looking
There's
south.
the dealership, you're on the left-hand side, top left corner is where you are.
Yeah, there you go.
I say, now I can see my office.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, right. Sorry about that. This is a pretty dense residential neighborhood. Here, the site, one of the 4 sites is this particular parcel here. I think that'd be an outstanding place to develop additional affordable housing, but the city would need to look into that farther. I think there's deed restrictions on that. That's not going to make that
There are
possible.
deed restrictions
Yeah.
that might make it difficult, yeah.
This was an old Coast Guard
Deed
property,
restriction.
so it went through the, this went through the BRAC process, similar to the senior center. And then, so this is restricted for recreational use. If it were not, that would also be a great place, but we don't see really any redevelopment opportunity at this site that wouldn't be, at least wouldn't be displacing a lot of families for a lot of time if you wanted to build some.
Sorry, so
garden style.
that Greenleaf Drive parcel or Holiday Drive parcel is deed restricted?
Yeah, I believe so. I haven't seen the
City-owned
top.
property that used to be the Coast Guard station has deed restrictions, and we need to look further into what those are, because it was, when we obtained the property, it was for recreational purposes, so that makes it difficult to put housing on. But we're going to look into it further, but we need the legal department to kind of help us with that.
So just for clarity purposes too, from our perspective, looking at that, we were not looking at the green area next to the wetlands. It was about redeveloping a building that's not only tired, but, way beyond its life expectancy.
Right, and it's
With all that
currently
part.
under a lease, so that would be the other thing we'd have to
To a
look for.
non-city entity?
To a nonprofit.
Got it.
Yeah. This is Gosling Meadows, the first property that was built in 1959. It's home to 124 family units and 31 buildings. There's a playground back in the back corner, and there's our central garage and office space here. We studied this with the Workforce Housing Coalition many, many years ago, and if you've done a charrette before, it was really just 2 days of working out there and with architects and engineers and bankers and that kind of stuff to come up with an idea. And we believe if we wanted to tear Gosling down and redevelop it, that we could add some additional units at Gosling. There's some complexity to that. These wetland buffers is all wetlands, high tension power line. These wetland buffer setbacks have become more stringent, but this is an 11-acre property. Some have suggested that redeveloping Gosling will make less of a neighborhood impact than redeveloping or building something at Sherburne School. And I'll tell you what, I'll go all the way and tell you I find that offensive to think about leveling a neighborhood that is home to 124 low-income families is not less disruptive than building at the Sherburne School or building anywhere. So let me start by saying that. And this is a many-year project. This could be a $100 million redevelopment if you go all the way and require displacing families. Is that a possibility? That's what housing authorities are thinking about all over the place, because most of the public housing in this country was built in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and they're becoming a little more difficult to maintain. So that's those. We've looked at a couple of those abutters, and then we'll also look at the Sherburne School property. Nope. Sorry.
I was going to say, don't you want to do this?
Yeah, search.
Can I ask a question while you're doing that? Mm-hmm. When analyzing these sites, do you ever consider alternative living styles or living capacities, such as shared living spaces, communal living, or multiple living, like apartment styles?
When I talk about redevelopment, I usually talk about, especially with our older properties, either rehabbing, if you gutted Feaster, for instance, and brought it up, did something like that, you'd have to displace 110 people that live in that building for a long period of time. But there are some programs that might allow us to do that. So there's possibility for rehab. There's possibility for redevelopment. We look at that as well. Can we add some units? And I also like to say there's opportunities. We look at opportunities for repositioning these properties. We have about 290 seniors that live with us. We've got about almost the equivalent number of people who have disabilities. And in some cases, we have lots of people who arguably may not be successful living independently. We're not an assisted living facility or anything like that. So developing a single, an SRO or some other kind of program, some congregate housing, we'd have to find money for that. We don't do any of that programming, but those are all
I guess
possibilities.
maybe
yeah.
the easiest analogy would be like a dorm style living where you have
Talk into your microphone.
2 or 3 bedrooms in a communal kitchenette space and living space.
You're talking more boarding house.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, I shouldn't refer to it that way, but single room occupancy is how or an SRO.
Okay.
Like Brewster Street was. That was a real loss for low-income people in the city. 200 Greenleaf Ave. There's 3 or 4 SROs in the city, and that could be a great model for us. Doing some veterans housing in that way could be really cool. So yeah, just coming up with that program. Right now, we see the demand is workforce housing. There's a huge demand for that. The success that we've had downtown, the stories you could hear from the residents that are living there, it's life-changing. We had 500 people apply for those 64 units. There's 280 still on the wait list. There's a huge demand for workforce housing, and that's what we proposed at the Sherburne School.
I'd just like to add one quick point. The Portsmouth Housing Authority recently completed a study of the market in Portsmouth because we wanted to make sure that the work that we're doing is in line with what the community needs. And the projects that we're proposing come from that analysis. And so workforce housing for certain numbers of units for families was identified as the largest need among many large needs. So the type of housing that you're talking about is certainly a need and would be useful to the community. We're trying to, in all things, we're trying to focus on the biggest needs first to do the most good. And so that's just a little by way of explaining our prioritization.
Right.
Is
Yes.
that study something you could share, or is that proprietary?
Once the city council puts us on the agenda, we'll.
No, I think that
That study's already been made.
Oh, that
That
study's
study's
on our
already
website,
public.
Yeah, but we're preparing, the city had asked us to do a report specifically on the Sherburne School. We had looked at all these city-owned properties a long time ago when the city council started talking about the workforce housing being a priority. And so it was, it's abundantly clear to us that the 5 acres here and the, respectfully to the people at the Panaway neighborhood, I think people really feel an emotional connection to this, and that this parcel is a part of their neighborhood. But if you looked at those other sites and the proximity of residential or the proximity to other homes in the neighborhood, we do have 19 homes across the street. Council Blaylock lives, and then we have an office park and an industrial park and a interstate highway. So there is on the other side of that highway there is a lot of homes in the Panaway neighborhood, and but the idea of being able, we would lose the softball field. Councilor Blaylock on the Recreation Committee was able to get the council to move up money in the capital improvement plan, $100,000 for study of new fields in Portsmouth, which is on the 10-year plan, but to move it up 2024 and then $3 million in 2025 in order to replace that field. And really, when you talk about the 4 sites, really the punchline is we could do them all. We think affordable housing and workforce housing and should be everywhere in the city, not in certain areas of the city. That's kind of what happens in cities. You end up building affordable housing on the crummiest piece of land. We don't believe that's true. That's not what we did downtown. So the question really is, in what order? And if you think about in what order to the criteria Adam was speaking about, from our perspective, and I think when we have some more community engagement, some better community engagement than we did back in January, I think people will agree that to add some scale and to do it without a lot of disruption in the neighborhood and do it quickly, that 35 Sherman Road. Top.
I'm curious, Adam, if if you guys have looked at the Falkland Way, Bedford Way, as to how many units, because I know it's hard to determine what the size of that actual lot is since it's part of 2 different properties. So have you guys looked at what exactly might be able to go there and how many units might be able to be built there?
I don't think we've done a study that shows how many units would be able to go there. It really is a function of the geometry and the size of the lot, and so without hiring, we've hired an architect to look at that here so that we have some more concrete knowledge. But if you were just looking at the size and the geometry of each of the lots, it would be clear that this lot stands out above all the others in terms of economies of scale.
You had a question?
Yeah, I'm just curious if the Housing Authority ever looks to purchase existing housing stock when it becomes available.
We have tried to do that, and we would try to do that. Very capital intensive, and the thing in this real estate market is you've really got to have first mover advantage, which means that you have to have a huge balance sheet to be able to make an offer when these things come on the market, if they do, and then to be able to execute on that. We're a healthy organization. We try to keep a strong balance sheet. But if Ledgewood Apartments were to go up for sale, or if Patriots Park were to go up for sale, those would be outstanding opportunities for us to purchase.
Just thinking of the one on Miller Ave, that
Rockland.
And
Miller.
Yeah,
Rockland and Miller. Yeah.
we tried to buy that,
Yeah.
and we lost out to an investor who there was a 20-year. Section 8 contract
Right, that ran
that
out.
building had on with HUD. That contract ended, and they canceled that contract. The new owners canceled that contract, had bought it for $2.9 million, sold it for $10 million 2 years later, and that's what's going on in the city of Portsmouth. So in the 6 years it took and $16 million that it took to build Ruth's Place, we lost 48 units on Rockland Street in 60 days. And that's happening all over the place.
And I'd just like to add to that comment. I mean, I think that explains a little bit about our sense of urgency, because not only are we not building housing fast enough, but we're losing it. We're losing this battle. And our financing comes predominantly through the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority, and the cycle to do that is very long. There's a huge amount of work that goes before applying for those tax credits, and we're competing with people that have a balance sheet that allows them to make a purchase in just a few days.
Andrew?
With respect to, let's use Sherburne School as an example, you've got a single-family home there that looks to be about an acre, and adding an additional acre to the forefront of that site and the envelope of that site seems like a nice opportunity, and that's the purchase of one home and one single-family home rather than 48 units. But acquisition of abutting parcels, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, because you're trying to be cognizant of the neighborhood, going and approaching these folks once you have a firm understanding of your viability on the Sherburne School, for example, if you could go ahead and purchase that single-family home and work with those owners to relocate them and understand if you could go ahead and buy that.
Well, Andrew is thinking like the real estate broker that he is. It's almost always, when you're developing new property, almost always to do what's called an assemblage. When I say an assemblage, it's mean piecing properties together. So, whether we could acquire this property from Stephen Maureen here or not, but you can definitely see that it would be advantageous to a project here if that could be done. And I say least community impact here. There's still 19 homes across the street, and of course Steve and Maureen are watching this more closely than, and we're keeping in touch with them more than anybody in the city because they're actually the direct abutter.
Any other questions from our group? Any discussion on what this group feels priorities should be of the 4 properties?
I think it's very clear that it should be this property. It's for the top of the priority list. I think there's still a lot of work, obviously, that needs to go into it. I think when we talk about economy of scale, I think there's a lot of worry in the, I mean, we want to build as much affordable and workforce housing as we can, but obviously staying within a relative respect of the community. And I think that has been one of the fear points, and I'll call it a fear point, of the concern. So I think that, you know, once we can get that addressed, there's a lot of concern of, you know, how do we do it respectfully within the neighborhood, but also make sure that we can maximize, knowing that we are in a crisis, and whether people want to accept that, it's a national crisis. It's actually an international crisis. You talk about in Barcelona and all these cities overseas, and so it's figuring out how we can, and I guess that would come back for PHA to bring back to us to some degree of what the numbers work out, how the math can math, and how we can do it in a way that doesn't feel overpowering and addresses some of the fear points.
Andrew?
I said this when it was initially proposed, I think, at a city council meeting by Craig and his team about Sherburne School and not further exacerbating sort of the issue of Panaway Manor and not being accessible. So I don't think that it's not solely the housing study of the feasibility of one certain site, but it's also the surrounding access to transit, the surrounding access to grocery and other general lifestyle needs and necessities for individuals or families. So if you take Sherburne School, for example, obviously there's the most capacity there in the building sense, but also we would have to then consider access, whether it's a coast bus stop, whether it's any other transit options, and then like the long-term duration of having residents there and the traffic, et cetera. To the Junkins parcel in the lower lot here, obviously that one's kind of satisfied that because you're downtown, and a lot of these residents, if they do work or live or operate downtown, it's much easier to walk about that area, and there are existing bus stops as well. But to me, the Junkins lower lot, I don't want to default to like a 3 or 4 story building. Obviously that's the highest yield, but maybe there is a better fit character-wise for the neighborhood. I know that the south end of that area is pretty eclectic in the housing style, so maybe there is a smaller cottage style form of living that we could look at, or just something that differs from what I am defaulting to in my head of a 4-story apartment building that, you know, is relatively easy. It may not be as easy, but it may eventually fit the character neighborhood better.
Yeah, right.
I think it's also important, and this is just a residential fact, is that the police commission will be coming forward, I believe, at some point this month or next month with any potential sites, that city-owned potential sites that they're looking at. So I think that that's part of this conversation also, is that there's some city-owned sites that they're looking at. So we have to make sure we're cognizant of that too.
Councilor Blaylock?
Thank you. No, I really appreciate looking at all these properties. I hope everyone watching, I hope everyone paying attention does as well. Obviously, with the deed restrictions on Greenleaf, obviously that's very attractive. That kind of ties our hands. We can't do anything right now with that. The Bedford Way, that incorporates combining properties, that incorporates, and I mean, again, we're looking at the same thing over there, that Atlantic Heights neighborhood is on an island, just like Panaway. You know, we'd have a lot of the same issues there that we would have with developing near Panaway. And then the Junkins Ave parking lot, obviously that would, it's in the historic district, it would have to have some sort of, you know, parking underneath, or I don't know, building, but that would be, I think that would be a difficult project. But not saying that that is not something in the future that we should definitely tackle. Then that leaves us with a Sherburne, you know what I mean? That kind of, it leaves us with that. That doesn't have as many issues as we're not, our hands are not tied with that property as much as with the other properties. So, I mean, obviously that gives us the best path moving forward. I know a lot of people are concerned with that, but at this point, I mean, I live right across the street from that. I'll be impacted more than anyone, but I agree that that's the site that is most viable. I think the biggest worries are the economies of scale, traffic studies, and all those things. We still need to look at that stuff. But
Have you guys looked any further at the school itself and the possibilities of actually rehabbing that building into units? Like you did at Lafayette School and that sort of thing.
Yeah, we would like to, be somewhat deferential to folks who said that there should be other kind of uses there at that school. But if there's no organization or the city wants to invest the, $6 to $10 million into preserving that for a recreation center, a library, or whatever, then we would certainly propose it be housing. We think we could get 12 to 15 units of housing in that building, probably the less traffic impact that you could have, with any other use. But we'd be deferential to the city, but certainly would propose housing if there's nothing else.
And just from an architectural perspective, I think that building, it sort of defines the street front there, and it's a piece of the character of the neighborhood that people are used to. And so if you talk about fear points, I mean, a great way to address that is to preserve that building so that the impact to the feel of the neighborhood is minimized.
I can assure you that as long as I'm working on this and Adam's working on this, that building's going to stay there. There's no question. And I really apologize to the people at Woodbury Manor. This is I forgot one. This is a public housing unit complex. There's 40 units here, also built in the 1960s. So could there be some redevelopment opportunities there? Potentially. It's pretty dense already. There is a what's called a paper street, or if you look at the tax map, right here, there's a paper street that's owned by the city. And this 113 Cottage Street, this two-bedroom ranch, is actually owned by the city that purchased that, was going to add some value maybe to the senior center. Again, that's a tiny piece of city-owned land, so the rule applies everywhere. It takes as long to build something big as it does something small. Is there not always, but could you put? There's a huge 20-foot slope here too. That's a problem. But could you put a few cottages in here or something like that? Maybe. Maybe if you combine these two. So I just don't want to forget talking about.
Yeah, maybe we need to add that to the list. Councilor?
One other thing, I know people are going to ask about community campus as a potential site. I'll just restate. The rec study did say that we should be keeping a centralized site for our recreation. I know if you're going to put up a bunch of lights and keep them lit, till 10 o'clock at night, and then have announcers and stuff like that, it's hard to combine that with housing. But I know we're still surveying that land that the city purchased, so that is not. We don't have a full understanding of what's buildable there, what that site looks like yet. But I just wanted to say that before.
Any other comments? Go ahead.
I think we've identified at least two sites, the Sherburne School and the parking lots, plural, out behind, and I wouldn't limit it to just the lower. I'd consider the upper, topographic upper lot. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say I'm concerned, but I'm just wondering about the idea of pre-selecting the Portsmouth Housing Authority as being the only development partner. And actually, let's stay away from that word development partner because it's got a bad taste in this city for good reason. New Hampshire Housing Authority, as Craig and Adam mentioned, has a lot of competing firms for the money that they distribute and the programs they administer. And I know there are other developers that do this sort of thing in the state and beyond. I wonder if the city should consider an RFP or an RFQ to get ideas from the private sector for how to develop these properties, and to get some ideas from, and Portsmouth Housing Authority perhaps would rise right to the top of the list immediately because of its home court advantage. That would be great. But I just think it just feels wrong to me to pre-select what is essentially a private construction company arm of the public authority that has some city input in terms, as we explained earlier. And you don't know until you ask the private sector. The private sector is more engaged in creative thinking than public sector is. So I'd encourage that idea. The other thing related to this, the bigger firms such as Portsmouth Housing and some of the larger developers are going to have a hard time coming in and looking at that one we just looked at on the screen with a small ranch to redevelop. I don't know if this is possible, but I know up north in the Lakes region, Kingswood High School used to do a program with the kids in the school where they would build houses and actually sell them on the market. And because it was a educational program, it was subject to a whole different set of economic criteria. Is it possible to find either an affiliation with a school and or some developer or some other agency we're just not aware of that could come in and economically build workforce housing on these small parcels that we didn't even look at because we weren't thinking of that? I don't know how many of them there may be. Maybe that's the only one. So it seems to me there's two things that maybe we just haven't thought of, and I'm all for ideas in education and bringing things in from the outside. And as I said, these guys have the home court advantage and they'll probably rise right to the top, but why not ask?
Adam?
Can I speak to, I'd like to take your second point first, and I'm going to start by apologizing because I have to go to another appointment, so I'm going to leave after this comment. But I've been involved in some of the projects that you spoke in architecture school, and we built a house this was in New Haven. There were some very disadvantaged neighborhoods, and we would go out in the neighborhoods, build housing and sell it as owner-occupied housing for the first time. It's a fantastic type of program, very close to my heart. I think it's a wonderful thing. I think Portsmouth doors should be always open to that type of program if we can make it happen. And I think this applies to both of your comments. The issue is that there are things that make it very difficult for, you said, why not have a for-profit developer come in and handle this? There are things that make that very difficult. In my opinion, obviously, I'm affiliated with the Portsmouth Housing Authority, but Portsmouth needs as many entities doing this work as possible. But our history says that there are only a few entities that have the experience and the focus to do this kind of work. And so, if I would never say no to having a for-profit developer do affordable housing or workforce housing in Portsmouth, and I think there are no limitations on how many entities can do it, but in practice, entities that are focused exclusively on not-for-profit workforce and affordable housing are the ones that have the experience and the thick skin to go in and do it. And I think that's part of why you see us as the primary actor in the city doing this.
That's the home
We're
court
built to do
advantage
it.
that I mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, we're built to do it, and that's our goal. But I really appreciate your comment about the student-built housing. It's a wonderful thing, and if we can do it wherever we can. Thanks for your comments. I apologize to have to go.
Thank you for your input, Adam.
Thank you, Adam.
Any other questions from committee members or comments?
So Falkland is still in the mix, correct?
Oh, yeah.
It would seem like would be fairly easy to pull off.
I
I mean, you already own half the. It's not wood.
I would wonder in Falcon in that area when they put the condos up in there. I know there was a lot of flooding issues, so I would worry about the
drainage,
the flood levels. I mean, I would already say, as someone who lived in Atlantic Heights for years, those basements all flood in general, and so I'd be worried about the water table adding those in that area. But I mean, it's something we have to look into all of
Have a
them.
basement if you're building a slab, wouldn't you? Anyway.
There's a lower level in our Atlantic Heights in the school, not a full basement. There's kind of a rec room.
Not new construction.
Yeah. We did a terrible job at rolling out the Sherburne School idea. There's no question about that. That was out of order, too soon, and proposing too fast of a time frame. That was done with intent. The moving it along was what we really wanted to do, because that's what I think this crisis, housing crisis warrants. But that was just too soon, and I know there's a lot of people at Panaway, several that objected, but a lot of people at Panaway who really are on board with this and would be on board with this, as long as there's no mystery, as long as we communicate well and engage folks, so.
So I've heard from the group that they really like 35 Sherburne is sort of the top of the list, but I don't see a consistent, what would be second priority? Would it be the lower lot, or would it be Falkland, Bedford?
I would lean towards the lower lot.
It's
Anyone
really
else?
difficult to say without a yield or what are you going to get? A feasibility study necessarily?
Well, this would be now go to council, this is the priority, because obviously if we're going to have to spend money, they want to prioritize where to spend the money, right?
Well,
Or
how
what to
are
look
we
into.
prioritizing?
I'm sorry?
Are we prioritizing based on number of units or ease of development?
I was just
or
going to say that.
Or what, because like I was saying, Falkland would seem like that's an easy one, relative to
Right, but based off
building
its-
something over here
right.
or Sherburne or the other.
Where do we want to advise the council what direction to go?
But before the council spends money, if we identify 2 or 3 or however many parcels and ask for outside input, as I mentioned earlier, the city might not have to spend any money other than putting out the RFP and getting ideas. Let the developers spend the money.
I did. Sorry. It's really hard to give our priority when there are subjective considerations to each lot, such as the residents, abutters, and existing neighborhoods. We saw that with Sherburne Road. That is something that we, as much as we want to prioritize something, we have absolutely zero control over that. So the impact, I think, maybe conducting some general meetings. We did this when West End Yards was being built. I personally knocked on 230 doors and said, come to Frank Jones Center and learn about this project. That's where the best and most valuable insight came from, and ultimately saved a lot of time and streamlined what was a pretty long proposal process and application process. Whether it's PHA, Joe Schmo, or the city itself, doing that now in a proactive way is only going to save a lot of headache and heartache, and also money.
Any other thoughts?
What are we selecting now 1, 2, 3, 4? To
I'm-
send to the city?
We were tasked with trying to prioritize these properties. There's been one
What
proposal
for?
that we asked the city council to put out request for proposal from developers on all 4 of them. Or I think we really probably can't do the Greenleaf until we get more feedback
Right.
on what can be done with that property. But we have the other 3 that we could submit and request proposals back, if that's what we want to ask the city council to do.
Obviously, Sherburne is very clearly the one that
The
stands
biggest.
out. It's the biggest. It's got the most acreage. It's the most. The city owns it. But I don't know if we have to decide between Bedford Way and the lower lot at Junkins right now. You know what I mean? We can say hey, these 2 is what we should look at next. But I don't think right now we need to prioritize stuff and we don't need to tick anyone off just by saying hey, this is above this is above, because we don't know yet. It's
It
been
sounds like
said.
an RFQ could be.
Well, the other thing, if
What?
we don't necessarily prioritize, let's say it came in that Craig's group is successful in developing the Sherburne school site, and 2 other proponents can do the other 2 sites. That seems to me the best of all worlds as terms of result of affordable housing. Or switch it around. Maybe you end up doing the lower lot. We don't know, and I don't think we can know without asking the outside world. And as I said, I work with private developers and municipalities all the time, and the creative ideas usually come from the private sector. There are opportunities. There may be somebody who wants to build a legacy. That
Or
happens.
joint venture.
That happens
That
too.
can
A
happen
joint
too,
venture, right?
I have a question as well. With the lower lot here, isn't that primarily the only parking for City Hall itself?
For the employees, that's mostly where they park, yes.
Just a thought. I don't know what happens to that.
Then you build parking, that's part of the program. Or you do something in the upper lot. These are design solutions, those are the fun issues to deal with.
Just passing thoughts in my head.
So we should go back to the city council, giving them the fact because the Sherburne lot is the largest, we think it's the most promising, yet we would like them to do requests, RFQs, out for at least our top 3.
What are we requesting?
Well, there would be my next question.
Well, you can do 2 ways. You can request qualifications, which is RFQ, or you can request proposals, which would be ideas. What are your ideas? And there may not be any response, which is a response. If the only person at the table is sitting to your right, then we have an answer. But at least we've asked the outside world. But you don't know until you ask. That's the point. And to Andrew's point, I agree. One criteria that I would use in evaluating any proposal is how much community engagement they would propose to use. That would be a critical part of it.
May I add, to the extent that we propose something too soon without a lot of communication with the neighborhood out there or the rest of the city, you are, just want to note that you are doing that, by recommending a development at Falkland Way, then we'll be doing the same thing as long as we have our eyes wide open to that. We don't really have the capacity to be managing sort of the public input part of that in multiple places in the city. And I'll also say about the Atlantic Heights, if you want to make a recommendation to Atlantic Heights, it would only be the city-owned half of that land. We will not sell our land for another developer to build on it. Of course. No question.
And I'm not sure it's big enough at that point.
Not at
which
any
is that.
price?
And just one issue that came up at the city council, I think Councilor Tabor asked it. The PHA can only ask for tax credits for one property at a time, correct? You can't be asking for several properties. Like, you couldn't go ask for all 4 of these properties and then see which one the federal government wanted to give you tax credits on. Or,
Yeah, exactly. We have to have, Ruth's Place needed to be full in order for us to apply again. So we're really talking, if we were really good at what we were doing, we'd be building one of these every 3 years. So yes, that is a reality. There's a couple different kinds of tax credits that you could use, but the capital subsidies are really skinny here. It's it's hard to do this, and you certainly wouldn't put in two applications at the same time. I don't even know they'd allow that, but it's way too complex a process to do that.
If I could offer a little, maybe to help Beth, because I don't want to feel like I've hijacked things here. There could be 2 options. One would be to answer the first question in terms of whether it's the highest priority. Sherburne School is the biggest. That's an easy choice. It's the biggest. And then there's these other 2 that we've talked about without actually voting on it. So that's the answer to the first question that council posed. But then a recommendation to consider an RFP to get outside private sector input on how and which of these parcels might get developed. Because if, as I said earlier, if Craig or another group can do 1 and 2 other groups can do 2 others and the city ends up with 3, that could be a wonderful result. Because there's an urgency here.
Which I think PHA would excel at satisfying that urgent
But
matter.
they can only do 1 at a time.
Right.
Right.
We're all in agreement to that direction, that we will ask the city council to make the requests.
yes.
All right, then I think we move on in our agenda, and we'll talk about the update on the density incentive amendments. Thank you, Craig. Thank Adam, too.
Let me see what's there.
Hopefully we'll be done before noon. This is going to be the Nick show or the Peter show or the Nick and Peter show?
It'll be the next show for now.
Share it on Zoom.
What do I need to do?
Go back to Zoom.
Yep. Share it.
Share it, and then choose it.
Can I ask a question on the general meeting? Not a direct question, but would it be possible for us to have a chance to speak since all of us are here regarding the Sherburne?
It's on the agenda at the end for public comment.
I understand, but
Yeah,
can
we
we
all have jobs.
consider moving up? so
And you
we
can
have-
you're okay
Please.
Let's just-
Because we do-
I'm sorry, I also have a business to run too, but it's on the agenda and we will get to it. We just have this
Can we
one more
consider
thing.
moving it up?
But then nobody will get to comment on the next section.
Seconded that. We all have lives here.
Decision on.
We're all here for what we know we're here for. Come on.
Please,
Give them 1 minute each.
please.
It'll be easier.
I will give people 1 minute and
That
at a
is
total
not
of,
enough. Please give us a full time to speak. Please.
I have a full agenda to get through. That-
Just move.
And you have a full room of people who are there to talk about one item.
Nine people.
It all.
Is there someone to speak regarding your next item in the room?
Yes, we have a presentation ready to go.
Is there someone to speak on behalf of that in your public forum?
Probably.
Yes, yes.
What do you want to do?
I'd like to move forward as planned.
What about our, you just said that you were going to give us time.
And you said 1 minute wasn't enough, so I'm
Yes.
going to proceed forward as planned and do the public comment at the end. Please continue.
Disrespectful.
Okay. I will go as quickly as I can to get to the public comment. There are a number of slides here. I made this presentation last Thursday at the planning board in the work session. We've got a zoning amendment that went before the city council that was referred to the planning board. The planning board, I believe, voted last Thursday to send this to a public hearing on June 15th, with the idea it would come back to the city council potentially on July 10th, also for a public hearing. So, again, fairly quick here. I think most of the people in the room, hopefully the folks in the back of the room that I didn't see some of you on Thursday, had a chance to either review the material or look at the tape, or you were watching. But there are 6 main parts to the amendments to the density incentives, and there are 3 density incentives in the character districts downtown. That's the first 3 parts of the presentation. And then we're proposing to make some adjustments to the community space types, which are the types of public use areas that are associated with these incentives, and an exemption for a particular kind of community space. And then lastly, a very small, somewhat targeted building height map change to Bow Street. So I'm going to quickly jump through those. So the first one relates to the density incentives. Again, there's baseline zoning in the downtown, wherever your property is, and then there are these so-called density incentives that allow you as a property owner to request, either through a conditional use permit or as of right, the ability to have a taller or a bigger building in exchange for community space and or workforce housing. So the first one relates to the overlay districts, and there are 2 of them in the character-based zoning. The character-based zoning is essentially different than the rest of Portsmouth, and it applies to the downtown and the West End, and there are some similar attributes for the Gateway District on Lafayette Road, but this is primarily focused or exclusively on the West End, North End, and downtown. That's it. So the existing density incentives for overlay districts, of which there are 2, you'll see a map on the next slide. We have a North End overlay district on the North Mill Pond, and we have a West End overlay district also on the North Mill Pond out on the West End. So what happens with this density incentive? Any parcel located in the North or West End overlay district can, as of right, not through a conditional use permit, not through discretionary requests from the planning board, but as of right, they can add 1 story to the height of their building or up to 10 feet. And they can also increase the size of the building footprint, put a bigger building footprint on the lot, if they provide at least 20% community space. And we have 13 types of that, which is, I'll gloss over very quickly in the presentation. Or they have to do workforce housing at 30% for sale or ownership units and 10% of rental. I will say that we've had 10 projects go through this since 2014 when it was adopted, and no one has yet done workforce housing. You see the word "or" underlined. everybody has chosen the community space option, which is part of the reason we're here, to see if we can recalibrate the numbers to find a better balance and get at least some modicum of workforce housing in the downtown. So who's used it? All these stars represent projects. That is the North End Overlay District you see on the map with the dotted lines. The stars represent the projects that have been approved since 2014. They're not all built, but everybody here provided community space in exchange for a taller building. The zoning was put together after a very exhaustive charrette done back in 2013, where the building heights and the building designs and the community space were all envisioned in the collective concept plan for the North End redevelopment. So this zoning was then a translation of that vision plan. So these building heights were supported by the vision plan back in 2014 is when we did the North End. Okay, so what are the proposed changes for the overlay district? There you can see the West End and the North End on the zoning map itself. So this would apply to both of those overlay districts. A big substantive change to this zoning amendment that's before the council and the planning board is to shift from an as of right, where the planning board in this case currently has very limited discretion to prevent or oppose somebody adding an extra story or a larger building footprint. We would be shifting here to a conditional use permit, which would at least give the planning board one, if not two hands on the wheel to decide whether the trade or the public benefit outweighs the private benefit, the carrot and the stick of the incentive. The second thing we're talking about in this amendment is requiring, in instances where housing is a component of the project, that I'm going to call them the developer, but the applicant will have to provide both community space and workforce housing. So the or becomes an and. And we didn't just keep the numbers the way they are. We had to recalibrate the numbers because the workforce housing of the community space, those are the sticks to the developer. The carrot is the taller building. The stick is providing this publicly accessible community space or workforce housing, both of which require a healthy subsidy. So we've had to adjust the numbers in the requirements to make sure this actually works in the marketplace, or we'll end up with neither. Because again, this is voluntary. It doesn't affect the underlying zoning. So you could look at that earlier map of the 10 projects that have used it, or at least 8 in the North End, and say, well, what's left? There are a number of properties that still would be affected, and this is just the North End, like 111 Maplewood or Lot 4 next to on Foundry Place or Deer Street. The Redland Johnson or the Ferguson building, that's certainly going to be replaced at some point, and 361 Hanover. Those are example projects that could be affected by the zoning amendment, and hopefully in a positive way. The second part is the second density incentive, which is utilized for properties either inside the overlay district or outside, so anywhere downtown, that require a larger building footprint than is allowed under the first density incentive or the underlying zoning. And an example of this would be the AC Hotel. The AC Hotel, because of the high groundwater, did not have the ability to put subsurface parking under that building. They needed a larger building footprint. They didn't take the height density, so they didn't need the last one. They went with the larger footprint. It allowed them to do a 40,000 square foot footprint, put parking at grade, and the second level on the back, provided they built a so-called liner building along the street, which is a commercial space, so we're not looking at parking or dead space, sort of like the Hilton Garden as you're going down Hanover Street, where there's not much going on. We want to avoid that in the code. So the AC Hotel used this second incentive. So did the Brick Market that's just opened. The footprint is larger than what's allowed in the underlying zoning. I think it's 17,000 square feet instead of 15. There are 2 levels of subsurface parking underneath the Brick Market, and there is the stick here for the AC Hotel and the Brick Market, or anybody else that uses it, is they have to provide 30% community space in exchange for that larger footprint. So, So again, it's for properties either in or outside the overlay districts. They get a bigger footprint, and it is a conditional use permit today, so we're not needing to add that. It's already a CUP. The liner building is a requirement, again, so the parking's not up against the street, and 30% community space is the existing requirement. So these are the people that have used it. What's the proposed change? We are, again, focused on requiring both community space and workforce housing in projects that have housing. So if you think of the Brick Market or the AC Hotel, neither of those projects have housing. So one of the amendments that came out of the planning board discussion last Thursday is maintaining the existing 30% requirement that's already on the books, because we had reduced it to 10% community space from the 30 that's currently required, initially because we thought we were going to include an in lieu payment program for commercial developments to be able to make a contribution, a financial contribution to workforce housing elsewhere in the city. The legal department did not feel the state statute supported that provision, so it was removed when this was filed with the council. And what I forgot to do was go back and say, okay, if there's no in lieu payment, we still want to make sure projects like the Brick Market provide 30% community space and not drop it to 10, because there's no housing in the Brick Market. So that orange highlighted text there is a proposed amendment to go back to what we have, again, for projects with no housing, like the AC Hotel and the Brick Market. So we don't lose ground. And there's the amendment. We don't need to go through it, but it was amended from 30 to 10. It would stay at 30 if you have development without housing. All right. These are the properties that could potentially be affected in the future. The McIntyre at 62 Daniel, 143 Pleasant, which is the Citizen Bank, 361 Hanover, which is the Kearsarge Mill, and 124 Bartlett, which is the placemaker space. Yeah, out on Bartlett Street. Those would all potentially qualify today and in the future for this. So the last incentive we have in the character districts downtown and in the West End apply to large parcels. So again, all three of these are already in the zoning ordinance. And the third part is for people that own an acre or more of land. And people that have more than an acre of land and they're outside, not inside or outside, but outside the North and West End overlay districts, they can, as of right today, not a conditional use permit, add an additional story or 10 feet if they provide 20% community space. And again, there's 13 choices of how you do that. I think the only folks that have utilized this is the Housing Authority with Roost Place at 160 Court Street. This did not require a conditional use permit for this particular aspect, but the building footprint on Court Street exceeded what was allowed in that CD4 district. So they were allowed, the height, they were allowed to get the 5th floor over in this area here with this particular permit. So what are the potentially affected parcels in the future, whether we change the code or not? So again, you've got St. John's with all their property on Bow Street, the church, and the parking lots. We've got the McIntyre, the Citizen Bank again, the Hanover Street property, the same Bartlett Street. 404, the hill isn't going to change, but it's more than an acre, so that one's not likely to change with the 16 structures that are out there. 501 Islington Street currently is the bank that's, midpoint between the West End and downtown. 16 Court Street's the Baptist Church. 500 Markets, Nobles Island, and 235 Maplewood is the Jackson Point condominiums just over the bridge on Maplewood. All of those today qualify for this additional story. So what, and there's actually more here. There's 18 that I've identified. So what are we proposing to change? We want to get away again from an as-of-right scenario where we don't have even one finger on the steering wheel and give the planning board the ability to determine whether a conditional use permit should be issued in order to grant this benefit to the applicant to have a taller building. It requires both community space and workforce housing, again, if you're doing housing. And we've had to, again, adjust the community space requirements, which are currently 20%. They're pretty small. We've had 8 years to look at these 10 projects that have come along that have provided community space, not always through this incentive, but actually do the calculations and get a sense of whether the 20%, the 30% are appropriate or adequate or deal killers to get the public benefit we're seeking in exchange for that added density. So the two comments that we discussed briefly on Thursday night at the planning board were, given there are 16 properties, and many of them are civic properties like the Langdon House, the mansion, Governor's Mansion, Moffett Ladd, Baptist Church, St. John's, those really were not the targeted properties for utilizing this incentive. So it made sense to us that we consider amending the amendment to remove this density incentive from civic properties, properties designated as civic uses, as well as the CD4 L1 and L2, which would essentially be that condominium project on the other side of the North Mill Pond, which has easements and power lines all over it, and the bank on the middle of Islington Street. Remove those and have this be focused on what was intended, which is the CD4 and the CD5, the higher density, the downtown properties. So that's an amendment to the amendment that's up for consideration. The other is, I've done some high-level evaluation of some of these properties that are likely to be redeveloped in the next 20, 30 years, maybe sooner. And I think, the incentives as currently drafted really focus on mid to large-scale developments because of the economies of scale that come with these large buildings. If we look at the North End, everything tends to be big because that's the most cost-effective manner for applicants to put these buildings together and make a profit. But there must be instances, at least in my mind, for somebody to take one of these larger parcels. For example, the Citizen Bank property, and I think I have an image here. That building was built in the 1960s. So let me just, right here. Let me stop for a second and just get to the slide. So these are examples of properties that would be removed, again, in the amendment to the amendment, the Civic and the CD4L1. This is the property out on Maplewood. So I think you get where they all are. The Hill, doesn't make sense for the Hill to be in here. The Hill is a great place, needs to remain there. We certainly wouldn't want to encourage anything that would potentially change that. And certainly I'm aware, as is everyone in the room, the Historic District sits on top of pretty much all of these properties. So there is that extra level of defense or protection in the city. But we should make sure the zoning doesn't conflict with the real purpose and intent of the Historic District, which is not to remove historic resources or replace them. So here's an example of what I'm talking about with another potential carrot to a property owner. If the Citizen Bank property on Pleasant Street across from the Langdon Mansion was ever up for sale and redeveloped, and right now the current zoning allows a 3-story building on that property and 90% coverage. So you could put a lot more on that property than what's on there now. And that bank sort of sits down. I think it might have been an A&P or a grocery store. I don't know what it was originally, but it's not the most attractive. It's not what we would probably do in 2023 if that was a vacant site and we were trying to put something on it. So this is just an example of another opportunity that I think we should not discount if somebody redevelops that property in that neighborhood with residential developments across the road, beside it on the corner of Pleasant and Court, that you could do small-scale either residential or mixed-use buildings. All I did here was take the property, which is 1.2 acres, the bank, and just show you this is the Hill in the middle slide, and this is, you could fit almost all of the Hill on that property. But right now, this would require dozens of variances to do if somebody decided that was the highest and best use, or the community decided, gee, we'd really like to have something more commensurate and residential and complementary to what's across the road and what's at Pleasant Street and Junkins and what's at the corner of Court Street and Pleasant next door. So the amended language is above in blue, but essentially all I'm hoping to achieve here is that we don't lock ourselves into what we initially adopted in 2014 and 15, which is a pathway to large-scale development only, which is what we typically are finding we're getting everywhere. This may never happen, may not be able to compete economically I'm not taking away the big box option, but I think we need to provide a variety of options because we don't know what the future holds and what the future holds for each of these properties. Okay, I'll speed up, and I apologize it's taken me this long to get to public comment. The community space types, we were talking, there are 13 of them now. There's only 12 here. I didn't have space for the 13th one, but there are 13 of these in the code. Things like greenways, parks, playgrounds, squares, wide sidewalks, outdoor dining, etc. So what we're proposing to add to this, and these are the types of community spaces you can apply to these density bonuses. So in the initial amendment that went to the city council, we're talking about adding 3 more types: a pedestrian passageway, which would be, if any of you have been to Newburyport and you go up State Street, these tunnels that go between the buildings on the ground floor and take you into a larger community space on the back of the buildings. We've looked at doing some of these things in our community plan for the McIntyre project, and they add a lot of interest, and it's something that we don't currently allow for in the community space types. To us, it makes sense that it be there as an option. Not to say that's the only way to do it, but right now you can't actually apply that as a community space. Same with a public observation deck. There's a lot of talk, there was in the community plan, about having a public roof deck on one of the buildings. Well, you should get credit for that as a community space. It would be deeded to the city with access, ADA access, elevator, stairwells, and the space on top of the building. So this is an effort to say, hey, it may never happen there, but if it happens in an appropriate place through a conditional use permit, at least the applicant's going to get credit for that, as they should. And then the last one that we put forward was the pedestrian arcade, this notion of having a covered area. If you see 4664 Maplewood, where Fidelity is at the corner of Deer and Maplewood, there are 2 sort of arcades on that building. They aren't continuous from one end to the other, but there's public space, a very wide public sidewalk. A restaurant could spill out into that space. So we want to make sure pedestrian arcades at least are a possibility should somebody come along. There would be public space underneath that. I'm sure you're familiar with what they look like. So 2 new ideas that sort of were floated at a high level at the planning board that I've been noodling around with, as well as others here, is the idea of a shared pedestrian street, and Chestnut Street is shown here. It's a great opportunity, if somebody does it right, to create a public amenity at great expense. We talked a lot about this with 1 Congress Street, with Haven and High and Ladd Street. I think we want to encourage the private sector to do these kinds of things because they cost a lot of money and they have a phenomenal public benefit. Oh, thank you. So again, this is allowing it to be a possibility, not saying it has to be done. That's what the shared pedestrian street is. And Chestnut Street, I think, is a fantastic example. People can still drive up that street, fire trucks can go up that street, but it is really a pedestrian-oriented design on that street. The last one we spent less time on, but it's something Rick and I have talked about, and I'm going to give full credit to Rick for this because I think it's a brilliant idea. It's the idea of, look, you think of the McIntyre site and the fact that we lost the post office, and we need a downtown post office. I don't think anybody doesn't agree with that. What a great way, whether it works or not, to encourage somebody in the private sector to create that kind of space. A post office, could be a museum or some other nonprofit, but a post office would work. That if somebody provides that kind of space in a building, they would get credit for it as community space. Again, an incentive to give the community what we're looking for. So again, it's not isolated or restricted to a post office, but the idea is if you have a community building that's dedicated to public or civic uses, the planning board, through the conditional use permit, can decide whether it's a fair trade. So those are the 2 new community space types that were not in the original amendment. This one's fairly straightforward. It's only 1 slide. When we looked at the idea at the McIntyre site of doing a raised plaza, because of the grade changes from Daniel Street to Bow Street, there's an 18-foot drop from one street to the other coming down Penn Hollow. Well, we've got to create flat terraced areas as you come down with hopefully community space. So here are 2 examples. These are in much more urban environments, but there's underground parking under both of those examples that are shown on the screen. And one's got a fairly leafy green park on top, and one has a more formal hardscape plaza. Both of those, in our mind, should count as community space. But we need to amend the definition of building footprint, because in both of those instances, given the number of steps you have to go up from the street to get into those spaces, they actually would count as building footprint. And that's a problem for many of these sites to provide those kinds of amenities. We do want parking on these sites as much as possible. We do want it underground. but we want to be able to program the top side as community space. And it'll be important here, since we're increasing, and I again did not amend the slide, and I remember forgetting this on Thursday. Most critically, for those properties over 1 acre today, you saw the slide of how it works. They get 1 story for 20% community space. We're proposing they get 1 story or 15 feet, and they have to provide 50% community space. So 2.5 times what we currently require. And the only way we're going to achieve that is to have this kind of exemption to allow either of those 2 situations where that public space is counted as community space and not penalized as being building footprint because the parking's poking up above the street. That's a really important stick that we're going to require a conditional use permit, 50% community space, and we're requiring some workforce housing if there's housing in the development. I'll go to the last one, and then we can go to questions in whatever order. The last one is fairly simple. It's an adjustment just like we did on Congress Street when we did the McNabb project there with the building height, in that case, going from a green line to an orange line, going up 5 feet. This one's proposed to go down 5 feet. It has a net zero effect on Bow Street because, again, the density bonus allows somebody to get 15 feet of extra height if they get the conditional use permit, if they provide the 50% community space, and if they provide the workforce housing. So what's being proposed on Bow Street, which is this area, which includes that house beside the McIntyre lot, all the way from Chapel down to Penn Hollow, that's currently a orange line, which again is a 45-foot building height to match the other side of Bow Street, this side over here. And these buildings exceed, some of them, the 45 feet, so it's kind of an average going down the Martingale building. But we're proposing if they choose not to do, whoever develops this site chooses not to use the density incentive, they will be required to stay 40 feet or lower along Bow Street. But since we want to encourage them to do the community space that we envisioned in the community plan and the workforce housing, we're going to allow them to get back to the existing position, but again through a conditional use permit. I'm sure it sounds complicated, what I just threw out there, but it goes from orange to green, down to 40 feet, but it goes up 15 feet with the incentive should they choose to request it, which ends up at the same place. So we are not affecting, for anybody that cares to know, the underlying development rights or the development rights of that property, regardless of who builds on it, are not being diminished by these zoning amendments. We're simply shifting from an as-of-right scenario for these larger, more intensive developments to a conditional use permit.
Great, thank you, Nick. Committee members have any comments or questions?
I have a quick question, Nick. Could you go back to the addition of the public benefits?
For which?
Where you're talking about Chestnut Street?
Yep.
So under shared pedestrian street, would that be requiring that the developer either provide improvements to an existing street or that they would then need to provide a new street on their property?
Yeah, easy answer, good question. Only a new street. This is only for a new street. So it'd be something on their property should they need it.
Counselor?
Thank you, Nick, for all this. I think this is all good ideas and good stuff to get what we want out of the zoning. But I want to thank Chairman Rick for adding the community building. That wouldn't, I understand, it'd have to go through a conditional use permit, so the planning board would have to approve it. But it wouldn't be like a foyer in a hotel. No. Right? It would have to be the whole building dedicated to community space.
Could be a condo. It probably wouldn't, just in the case of something that's multi-tenanted, it would be a space within the building.
Okay.
Could be a whole building, but it doesn't have to be.
Okay.
But it'll be defined through the conditional use permit with meets and bounds. It'll have an easement on it. The city council will have to accept that easement. So the planning board's got to grant a conditional use permit. Then the city council's got to accept the easement for the public space, the public benefit.
Other questions? All right, thank you very much.
No questions? Yeah, was that, okay.
That was it. And those incentives are going before the planning board for a public hearing on June 15th, correct?
Yep. Yep.
Anything else on that? All right, we're able to move on. The next steps for our July 7th meeting are listed in the agenda. I don't think we need to talk about them, but we will be digging in deeper into the gateway zoning for that one. And with that, we will start public comment. We will have people in the room first and then online. If you're online and you wish to speak, please raise your virtual hand.
Hello, my name is Ruben Izagiri. I live at 337 Colonial Drive in Panaway Manor. The first thing I would like to talk about is an obvious conflict of interest. This gentleman represents, Mr. Welch, represents the best interests of his organization that pays his salary, which I'm sure is very substantial, right? So it's like having a prosecutor on the jury. Why would he have anything to do with the decision of the city to give free land away to your organization? Right? So we're giving land, city land, away to a private organization. Right? The second thing I would like to talk about is that this analysis that originally showed the Sherburne site as the #1 site here is completely subjective. This committee should absolutely get outside analysis on what property the city does own that is best suited for this project. Have you guys even thought of that? To get outside this subjective type of thing? And you mentioned that Atlantic Heights basement floods. Did you know that all of our basements flood? Did you know that? You would have known that if you had done some real analysis, not this type of very subjective, type of thing, which would pass muster anywhere, right? So I demand that you guys do some objective analysis and have an outside party do this type, because you even said it yourself, you guys are not experts in this field, that you should, you need outside counsel on this. You guys are willing to spend thousands of dollars making these plans, but no money to have someone do an objective analysis on what property the city owns might be best for this use. And again, going back to this conflict of interest, I cannot even believe this glaring conflict is not addressed more often, right? And I guess that's basically it. I have got over 200 signatures. Do you not listen to your constituents saying we do not want this? It's funny and convenient that the original plan that Mr. Welch wanted is somehow going through now. You just kind of placated us with a dog and pony show with, again, a very subjective, frankly, BS analysis that showed, oh, well, our original plan was the best plan without doing any outside scope of, investment or anything. So this is disrespectful for the community. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, anyone else wish to come up and speak?
My name is Genevieve Beckstead Muskie. I live at 9 Sherman Avenue, resident of Panaway Manor. Oh, excuse me, I have to take my glasses off. Panaway, we are aware of the needs of the community. We do listen, but at times it is important to be heard. And unfortunately, that has not been the case for our neighborhood. I know you had spoken about residents of Panaway supporting this. I've yet to encounter a resident that does. Panaway spoke in great opposition and listened and instead of hearing our comments, your choice was to proceed, obviously, as you've all chosen to do so today, in an effort to meet your personal agendas. One of the adverse impacts we had talked about is the sports. I actually brought several of the girls from the softball fields to speak to the city council in opposition of this. And with the removal of that field, they have no place to play softball at all. And it's girls' sports, which I'm not going to go there. I understand you talked about putting funds together to relocate it, yet every time this city takes away any type of athletic community field, it is never replaced, and it never has. You also talked about the Greenleaf property can't be used because the purpose of it is for recreational. Well, I will also remind all of you that where that public library sits was supposed to be exactly the same, but everybody figured out a way to put the library there anyways. A number of affordable housing in Portsmouth far exceeds any other community in the state, and I'm wondering why this is a hat that we all have to wear. I understand it's a popular community, but we have to set some limitations. We have to consider what our community wants, what our neighborhood wants. We are not just a fish stick factory. Thank you very much for that wonderful reference. We do represent, we are not recipients of great family wealth, as a lot of people apparently seem to think that Panaway is a wealthy neighborhood. We are hardworking people. We are taxpayers. We are registered voters, I will remind you all, of a community who are being vilified for speaking out in opposition of personal agendas. Please stop talking to us and listen to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Good morning. My name is Manny Garganta, 471 Colonial Drive. Where to start? I'm still hung up on Greenleaf. I know there are deed restrictions. There was things been there that when the Coast Guard turned it over to the city, I know with how things work two ways. There's ways to get around that. I know that Crossroads has a lease on the place. Leases can be bought out or whatever. I think it's a good place because it's right across the street from Mr. Welch's Wamsat place. I think it's a good location. Taking into consideration Sherburne, I knew that was going to be the number one place. Let's be totally realistic. I've looked at the other places. You've got an unencumbered 5 acres out there. We have going on now on Borthwick, you have the hospital building a new parking lot. They wiped out the left side on Jackson Gray. You have a hotel motel trying to get in on the corner of Coakley Road. You have Liberty Mutual still has not moved down all their people down there. So you have two locations, the bottom of Borthwick and the top of Borthwick, that brings in a lot of traffic. I know it's redundant to say that, but somebody better, I know there's no traffic study been done. Those we haven't heard of any. Sit out there at 7:30, between 7:30 in the morning and 8:39 on the top of 33 as they turn down. The stacking lane is backed up into the travel lane. Same thing going out at night. The bottom of Borthwick is, a cluster because from 3:30 on, you can't get through that intersection. Maybe we should put a roundabout down there. I'm sorry, I'm being facetious. But there's problems there with traffic. It's going to get a lot worse. Now, I understand we need workforce housing. I worked in Massachusetts for a few years. I didn't want to move to Massachusetts to be closer to my job. Nothing says you have to be in Portsmouth to work in Portsmouth. Granted, things have changed financially, but we have to look at it in many different places. Sherburne is an ideal location. And you're right, there's an emotional attachment. My wife has lived in Panaway since 1946. All my sons went to that school. It kind of grows on you. I've been there 50-some-odd years. We have people that are generational in that area. It's not just Panaway. You have Greenland Road, where Rick lives. You have Sherburne Road. You have Holly Lane. You have Golterville, which is the old name of Greenside Avenue, because the Golters used to own all that property. So it's not just Panaway. When Panaway is synonymous. We were a gem. Nobody knew we were there. I wish it would go back that way because it's getting busy. We have to look at a lot of different things. As far as this RFP, I may not make friends. I'd rather see Mr. Welch, because I know what he does. City of Portsmouth does not have good luck with developers. You know, and I have a question. When we have a piece of property like that that goes to the PHA, do they get it for nothing?
It's typically a long-term lease.
Okay.
Yeah, we own it.
Right, okay. Now, I talked to the assessor, they pay a percentage of their rent for city services, stuff like that? Is that how that works?
I don't know.
I don't either.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I talked to the assessor yesterday. And this is, you know, Sherburne School has definitely a great location. But if something's got to be done there, a number was thrown out to like 140 units. Not going to happen. You know, people will go crazy. If it has to be done, and we're not down the road, let's take a look at the amount of normal units that can go in there. And why do we have to be the only city in this area that has to do workforce housing? That's the number one thing. We have other people that work in Portsmouth that come in from Portsmouth. Take a look down 33 coming in from Exeter. The place is crazy in the morning. They're complaining about all the jobs out at Pease. Well, gee, that's too bad. But this is where I feel. I feel we got, because we have a piece of property, it doesn't need to be developed. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Good morning. My name is Liza Hewitt. I live at 726 Middle Road. I do not live in the Panaway neighborhood, but I do find this process frustrating. I don't believe you've done your due diligence before making this decision. This decision was made amongst you to move this on to council without benefit of public comment, with these people coming here, giving up their time at work, and I realize that you all give your time up at work, but you make the agenda and you make the schedule, so obviously you have the time to give up. These folks have no choice. The structure of this, I understand it's hard. When do you put public comment? Do you put it before anybody's, before you all have the discussion? Do you put it after you've already made the decision? After you've already made the decision does not make a whole lot of sense to me. I've heard from the 3 councilors sitting on this committee that they're all in favor of Sherburne. I heard that almost out of the gate before there was even any discussion. What I heard from the rest of the people sitting on this committee was a lack of commitment to what was being decided by these 3 councilors. And so I question that. I heard the rest of you say, well, we don't really want to order these, we don't really want to stay. So I think there's a reason for that, and I think you need to look at why the 3 councilors are moving this on to the city council, with Sherburne being the top and no other priorities being listed after that, when the rest of the council or the rest of this committee did not really decide on that, at least not from what I could hear. You've made this decision without knowing what the deed restrictions are at Greenleaf. This was discussed at the last meeting a month ago. You've had a month. Nobody looked into the deed restrictions. So does that mean it was off the table before it even started? That's the way it would make me feel as a resident. Answers to the questions raised at the Sherburne meeting. I asked about that 2-3 months ago. Those are still not been answered. Eric Anderson made a long list of questions, as I recall, that he presented at that meeting. There were other questions presented about traffic and everything else, and nobody's answered those questions, but here you are deciding it's Sherburne and off we go. Everyone wants the same pieces of land. My understanding is that there's an RFP out for an indoor rec arena on the same properties. The police station has not been committed to. Nobody knows from the public where those properties are that they're considering. There's a study or something maybe on athletic fields and where those are going to go. We haven't heard from that yet. So how is it that this committee is deciding to move this forward to the city council with Sherburne as the top dog when none of these other, and everybody needs property? And that's where I worry about as a resident. I do not live in Panaway Manor, although I know they're going to be affected. and I feel for them. But I also feel for the rest of us as residents that know there are going to be other needs for these properties, and nobody's thinking about that. It's a race to the finish before you've even done your due diligence, and I question why. My last question, I guess, would be for Craig Welch, because it looks like he's in the top position to do whatever's going to be done. I'd like to know, as you look at the need for affordable housing, whether you are looking at potentially renting these units that are going to be built on city property that is in high demand at 60% AMI, at 80% AMI, or what appears to be the new level, which is 100% AMI that you just agreed to with the Cinemagic project. I think that that's information that the residents need to know, because I think there are going to be people that are going to have a really hard time if we're giving up this property to have, quote, affordable housing built, and it's really not affordable housing. So I would like some of that addressed. Thank you.
Excuse me.
Next.
Can I please ask Mr. Welch to pay attention to the public comments instead of taking care of his personal items?
I think he's taking
There's
notes right
no-
now.
I'm taking
There's-
notes on everything you're saying.
Anyone else that'd like to come up and speak, please come.
Good morning, Elizabeth Bratter, property owner, 159 McDonough Street. I would like to speak about two things. I don't know if there's enough time. Just in regards to looking at the properties, I think before anybody makes a decision, the number of units should be looked at each location and the type of units. So are you considering building only family units? Are you considering only building units for people who are K1 single people? Though that makes a huge difference as to what you're doing. The other thing is location, location, location. And although community campus says you can't live near recreation, I personally live between two high schools, and I can tell you, thank God we run the air conditioner in the summer, because both of them have games on the weekends. We're between St. Thomas Aquinas and Portsmouth Christian Academy. They have games all summer long, and the way you eliminate that problem is you close your windows and turn on your air conditioner, and then you don't notice them. But the truth is that you can live next to recreation, and the fact that community campus is automatically being cited as only can be used for recreation, I think is a little ridiculous. It's a pretty good sized piece of land. I think buildings are there already. It could be used for other than recreation. People can live next to recreation. It usually stops at 10 or 11 o'clock at night. If you live on Islington Street, you live next to a local restaurant, and they may have outdoor seating, and then you get to listen to them until maybe 1 o'clock. Well, on Islington Street, it's usually 9 or 10. But I think you can live next to noise, and if you're in a low-income housing setting, you're usually grateful to get someplace to live. So I do think it should go out and should be, all these properties, your list of 4 should be looked at for all different aspects, not just the size, but what can be built there, how many units, and so if you have family units, they want to be close to a school district, they want to be close to a grocery store. You know, people who don't have one car, which is often true for low income, having been there before, I can tell you usually have one car. One person has the car, is usually the person with the kids, the other person walks to work. Having walked to Yokins, I can tell you that we had one car for a long time, and we lived in low income because we lived on McDonough Street when nobody lived there. So I can tell you that some of the criteria you're looking at, the size of the lot, are not really relevant. What's really important is what kind of units are going to go there, who is going to be living there, how big are these units going to be. You want to look at location in terms of where is the closest grocery store and how can you get there. If it's going to take you 45 minutes to take a bus from Sherburne down to Market Street to get to go to the grocery store, that might be a problem. So you located all those people out there, but they can't get to the nearest grocery store. You could go down to Target, but that's quite a distance away. Where's the local grocery store? So you need to look at the whole picture. So that's it on all of that. You guys can do that. In regards to the character district changes, at the planning board, I took copious notes. One of the things that was requested was to when you look at the community space streets, that there's actually a definition of some kind between fire lanes and community space that's a street. That was specifically asked for. One of the counselors asked for a timeline on community space available. That would be a side note, not necessarily in the things. The other thing I noticed was in regards to the height incentive. On Bow Street, we want to lower the height so that the 15 feet doesn't become a problem. I think the 15 feet is a reasonable amount of space, but I think generally we need to look at all of our stories all over Portsmouth. Again, that should have been looked up last time, because of the fact that the 15 feet adds a significant amount of height to already existing height levels. The 50% of open space should include green space, not just open space. I think that's about 20,000 square feet if it's an acre of land, if I did the math right. That should include green space. I don't want to see a lot that's covered in pavement. I want to see real green space. And I'm not talking about a lawn with a little gazebo on it. I'd like to see some shrubs and some stuff like that. So that should be included in that definition of the 50%. The community space on top of underground parking, I think we need to remember that in some cases that underground parking community space, the grade could have an impact on the neighborhoods. So there needs to be some kind of clause that the planning board can use to say, we don't agree with this idea of you putting this open community space here, because now you're going to, in the case of 105 Bartlett Street, they put in these view quarters, but they're on top of their garage, so the garage is so far up you can't see over the view quarter unless you stand on a ladder on McDonough Street. So the view quarter exists, but whether you get a view or not are two different things. So you got to really pay attention to the grade. On 10A543.43, I think the wording needs to be the same as on the other one, and that is, it says at least 10% of the dwelling units within the building, or at least 2 units. It should say whichever is greater, not just or. I think that's a dangerous proposition there. I would just put in 2 and call it a day. On the number 3, the incentive for parcel over 1 acre, to amend 10.5A43.33. The word "that" seems excessive to me. So it says, that is not located in an incentive overlay district and that contains at least one. I could just say, and contains just at least one. That's just grammar. Then it says an additional story, and I already mentioned this, the additional stories should be looked at generally all the way around. And I think I'm coming, oh, there we go. Oh, and the museum. So I think the museum, all of that civic stuff sounds great. But if you think about it, on Congress Street, we have a new art museum. That's what it's called. I believe it's a store that sells art. I've never been in it. I haven't been too excited, I'm sorry, about some of the art. But it's called the New Art Museum. So I think that museum is a pretty open-ended thing nowadays, if that's considered a museum. So I thought maybe that might want to be, you might want to do the community building space and give it a little bit better parameters. So again, the planning board can say, well, that's not really a museum, or that really is a museum. So if you're going to put museum in there, you might want to be careful about that. And I think that's it for me. I needed to be someplace at 11, so welcome to the world. Thank you.
Anyone else in the room?
Good morning. Petra Huda, 280 South Street. The first thing I'd like to address, I know it was a long time ago, but when the ADU pamphlet was being discussed, the first thing I would look for as a resident is, can I do this? And it didn't seem like that was in the front of the booklet. I mean, when I went to do this, it was basically, what do I have to read? What is the easiest thing to look at? And according to the zoning that is in place now, can me as a regular resident understand what I need to do? And personally, that's what I was looking for in the front of this booklet, and that's not what came out. It was a little technical for me.
Could you say the first part again that you were, I just want to get your wording right when I take a note.
So what I'm looking for is, can I, as a person who's going to go and do this, can I have an ADU where I am? So the first thing I would have liked to see there is, you can have an ADU, or how do I get an ADU? You can have one if you're, I'll just throw stuff out because I don't have any idea. If you have this much footage in the back, if you have an acre, if you have this, if you know that kind of stuff, and kind of simplify the wording of the zoning to the regular person.
Agreed.
Layman's terms.
So yeah, and that's not when you started it, unless I missed it. That's not how it started.
Okay.
So-
No, a fair question or observation. I'll just quickly.
No, we don't, no back and
I
forth.
can't address it. Okay, I'll
No,
just
yeah, no,
listen.
yeah,
then.
yeah.
Okay. Apologies.
Okay. Okay, so on that, and then next thing, I would like to talk about your selection of properties also for the PHA. I mean, basically, I agree with Mr. Simonis and Planning Board Chair Chelman. I think this needs a little more research, especially the points that Mr. Simonis brought up that we're just kind of glossing over about the traffic and the convenience to services and everything else. Yes, it's a 5-acre property. That's great. But I also agree that we need more research on this. And it was just kind of interesting that before you had any input, you took a vote and you're going to move it on. This really seems like it's being rushed, and you're not gathering all the information for the council to make an intelligent decision here. I mean, do you want to go back again and have the council ask another set of questions? I would think not. I would think you were trying to think of all the questions that could be asked, possibly to move forward. That's on that. The last thing I would like to talk about is all the density stuff. I know, Nick, you just got finished with all of this, and there was some different stuff. I guess I just want to take you back to one thing that was said in City Council on this, and the main thing, the main focus of this council is to get more workforce housing. And the thing that the mayor said was, do we really need all of the other incentives here? We have not seen any participation in the workforce housing. But when looking at all of the incentives that are being put forward, it seems like we're going more towards better incentives and more incentives towards density and height and everything that we didn't want. And the workforce housing is going down in here. It's going from 20% to 10%. On a lot of the different incentives here, you're going the opposite way. So that's one question I have. The second one is on the density incentive for overlay districts. I did notice that you're taking down the greenways and the amount of feet between the water to the waterfront to 50 feet. What happened to the wetlands buffer there? I guess the next question is, are all of these in compliance with the state RSAs? Has this been checked first, or are we still in the process of doing that, and this is only our first draft? But it seems like it's moving back and forth between all the boards very quickly, and I hope we're doing our due diligence and don't get stuck not complying with the RSAs. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else in the room wishes to speak? I'm just looking to see if anyone raised their hand online.
Thank you. I'm Bill Bowen. I live at 1163 Sagamore Avenue, Unit 40. I'm with a group of about a dozen people that have been looking at affordable housing in the Seacoast for the last 6 months. We've talked with Mr. Welch. We've talked with Rob Price, who's the head of the New Hampshire Housing Authority. We've talked with numerous developers. We've talked to syndicators. We've talked to a couple of university professors. And we're not really ready to be totally, public on what our findings are, but I wanted to preempt a little bit by this situation today seems to call for it. There are two problems. One is this would be general consensus of the people who work in this field. There are two problems: zoning and capital. Not on that list is developers. There are developers. There are two large affordable housing developers, one based in Portland, one based in Manchester. There's a small developer, Harmony Homes, in Dover, who have built housing for their employees, which is a thought that should get broader use. There's a developer out at Pease who has a small operation that does affordable housing. So you can find people to do the development. Capital and zoning are the issues, and the community needs to demonstrate to the developers that they're interested in doing the work. A couple small thoughts. The density bonus is a important tool. I would just want to be sure you do it going down Lafayette, because there's a lot of development taking place down through Rye that doesn't seem to be solving the problem in terms of density bonuses. And there's a limiting thought that things that kind of don't cause people to think necessarily with an open enough mind. The low-income housing development grants, loans, cover construction. It doesn't cover land acquisition. So if you go to someone and ask, to look at a project, the city council asks, what property do we own? Because it's free in this proposition. If you open your mind a little bit and looked at the place at Atlantic Heights and said, okay, there's some land, part of that land we don't own. Well, what would be the ideal thing to develop there if we bought that land and put it into the pot? So my only comment is you need to think a little more broadly than just be necessarily limited by artificial restrictions. So that kind of leads me to the RFQ question. It was very unclear to me listening as to who the audience would be and what the request would be. You really need to be sure that you've got that right, that you've got the right question that you want to ask. Are you talking just about the property that you own, these 4 sites, or are you talking about Portsmouth? And you got to be sure that you got the right audience, because there are people who do this work. There's Evernorth in Laconia has done work that is relevant. And I would point again back to the Reynolds people in Dover who have done work. And Dover seems to be quite open to small unit development. So end of thoughts. But do keep your mind wide open and focus on the RFQ and what it is really that you're asking. Is it just limited to these 4 spots? Is it the limited to the city the property owns, or is this an invitation to the prom for developers who are interested in affordable housing?
Thank you. Anyone else in the room? Is there anyone online that wishes to speak? Please raise your virtual hand. I don't see anyone raising their hand.
I don't have a hand to raise.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, go ahead.
So this is Rick Beckstead, 1395 Islington Street. Just a few thoughts. The Sherburne, with some of the previous speakers, I do agree with, I guess, whether we've done our due diligence or not. Will remain to be seen. I'm sure there's still way more that'll come from that neighborhood and from others, as opposed to some of the other properties. Community campus, 4 acres, front, not in the back, not around the fields, but in the front, is what we saw when I was on council. That would be more than adequate for housing. The problem is everything has been kept under wraps. no one in the public has been aware of any acknowledgement, study, conversations that have happened because we have decided as a city to keep that closed and not involve the community, when a board or committee should have been put together along with our rec department and with some of the other boards that we have with volunteers. And that has not happened, at least publicly. It's happened behind closed doors. It needs to be brought out forward sooner rather than later. As far as the restrictions on Greenleaf, most people, whether they realize it or not, we've gone and we've done these type of restrictions before. We had the old armory, where we now enjoy our library. That had all kinds of restrictions, so much in fact that it involved the same type of restrictions that we had with our new senior center that's on Cottage Street. There were restrictions, and we were able to go and eliminate them fairly easy for the most part. And then we also had our middle school, which had a rec field that was donated the land, and that had stipulations. And we removed it, and we built the middle school, and we did an alumni field, which for the most part really didn't do what it was supposed to do, because that was supposed to be used for a recreation softball field. Is it used for tournaments, so on and so forth. There's a lot of people in the community that don't even get to partake in that, including our girls. I have watched this entire season and the amount of girls and families that have gone and participated at that field. And by eliminating that one, before anybody moves forward, there better be a plan and replacement. And to the taxpayers and the residents of Portsmouth, it's going to cost you. Now, if Portsmouth Housing Authority was willing to go and step up to try and make some kind of contribution or a way to go and do it, I think that would be a step in the right direction. But there has got to be a guarantee, ironclad, that that field gets replaced before anybody moves into any of 4-story or 3-story buildings, whatever it is. This is the easiest solution because you got an empty hole, period. It's the fastest way to go and do it, and nobody seems to want to go and take the challenge. And I think that's one of the most discouraging things to Panaway Manor and to the rest of Portsmouth. For now, I'll leave it at that. I hope you all have a pleasant day. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else online that would like to speak? Not seeing or hearing from anyone. Are there additional comments from the committee members?
I'll just say and reiterate, and the mayor said this too, we will not take a field away from any group of anyone before we replace them with another field. I live right across from Sherburne. I often, I see the tournaments, they have the games on Saturdays and stuff. Right now, as it sits, there is not enough parking for the softball. I would hope that we would actually not only replace this field, we would actually give them a place to park and a new, nice field. But we would not do anything to their current field until that would happen. I would reassure that.
Any other comments?
I'd like to make one suggestion. I didn't
talk into the microphone, please.
I got to give you that. I didn't say anything with the city-owned property discussion, but listening to everybody here during our discussion and the public comment, I'd just like to make a suggested motion for you guys to consider, for all of us, in maybe clearing the air, because I think we're all saying similar things, at least to my ears, meaning the committee members and folks that have weighed in. I think based on our high-level preliminary site assessment that we did as primarily staff, which was presented to you folks last meeting and maybe the meeting before, that and our resultant shortlist of those 4 properties, that I think the committee is telling the council that we support the consideration, continued consideration, evaluation, and prioritization of the Sherburne School being, number 1, preserved, rehabilitated, and reused and or portions of the property redeveloped for reuse as multifamily housing and maybe some other things that, require more due diligence. I think that's the message we're sending the city council. It's not our charge. We've not been given the charge to do a deep dive, hire outside consultants, and drill down and figure out what the composition is, what the type of housing is, where it's located, what the density is, how the traffic is managed, the drainage, all of that. That's not been our charge. Our charge has been to look at this at a high level. Is this property suitable for reuse, preservation, number 1, rehabilitation and reuse as potentially housing and/or something else yet to be determined. And I don't think anybody in the room could say no, unless you don't want the building. And I think that's the message we want to send, and we want to be clear that this motion, if it's a motion, is not a determination of composition, type, or density. We don't know whether it's 20, 40, whatever that number is, 5. That due diligence that everybody's asking for is not our charge, but it's going to be someone else's. And if the city council comes back and says, here are the resources for you guys, which I probably argue we're not well suited to do that, to go out and design a site for somebody else is kind of backwards. So it's a site that's suitable for how much and the quantity, quality, and character, that's yet to be determined. But that's what I think we're saying. It's a priority. But we are not trying to nail down whether it's 40, 60, or whatever units. That's just not our charge, at least in my opinion. I think clearing the air on that might help some of the people in the room thinking that's somehow what we're doing. But I'll stop.
Any other comments?
I agree with Nick. I mean, I felt our charge was to look at city-owned properties and come up with a list of ones that could be developed for housing. And we came up with 4. So, and I don't feel comfortable prioritizing any one of those 4 over the other, because I don't have enough information, you know, and you know, it has everything to do with where it's located, what neighborhood it's in, and how long it's going to take to get through the process. So, you know, I think that's what we're doing.
So are you in agreement, or all of us in agreement, that the request for proposals might actually bring us back additional information that we're looking for?
I guess if we're even charged with doing that.
Well, we can ask the city council if that's the direction they
Yeah.
want to go based off of our
I
discussion.
don't know, we've got counselors here that could weigh in maybe, I don't. What,
I made a suggestion a couple months ago to engage outside engineering to look at these parcels, and one of the questions was, is there money to do that? And since it didn't happen, I'm assuming there wasn't money to do that.
Right,
We obviously can't spend any money. The council can spend money. I think one option, if we go through the RFP process, the developers spend money. We give them the authority to spend money and do the analysis. That can be outlined in the RFP. The alternative is the council can say, here's X amount of dollars, pick a firm, work with them, isolate it further. I don't see it as being necessarily analyzed to where you can get 75 units or 40 units or 20 units or whatever like that. But there were things missing. You know, there was no zoning analysis done with the prior. It was a quick staff review. I mean, and I'm not criticizing, just it is what it is. Hydrologic analysis, staff can't do that. And engineers probably can't do it without spending money. They might have, if they've done work on adjacent properties, they'll have some base information to work from. So I think to agree and disagree with you at the same time, I think we are thinking along the same lines, but it's just a question of how that data gets gathered. And I was trying to put it onto the private sector. That was my idea.
And my suggestion is that we then can ask the city council, do we want to try to find a plot of money as we're about to, you know, to talk about the budget on Monday? Or do, you know, for the upcoming year, unless we can find money currently, and I don't know if we can. I've asked and no one's given me, yes, we have some, so that's why I assume it's a no, and nobody comes back and says, yes, we can give you this amount of money. So, you know, the request for proposals is a good idea as a way to take it a next step forward, but I think that in the end is a council decision as to whether or not they want to go that way, and the direct input, and we've got a lot of input to give them, and wish to be able to ask those questions of them, and then we could give staff direction if that's the direction they wish to go.
So I would just add, I definitely don't think we want to get the cart too far before the horse. I would really like the city council to make that decision and have a conversation with the Portsmouth Housing Authority. I'm not sitting here convinced they haven't answered all those questions in their due diligence that relate, I mean, the zoning is a much more minor issue given the location of that property and what's around it, but the hydrological conditions and the fact that there's a building there that would support 15 to 20 units, for example, that doesn't require any construction beyond a rehabilitation. If that was the end of the project, to me, that would be enough for the city council's got to make that decision, whether the ball field's included or not, and whether it's moving or not, and whether there's a building back there or not. This is a large parcel. It's a building the city is vacating, as I understand it. If the city's vacating the building and the community wants to keep the building, we need to figure out what to do with the building. And that's a city council charge. But I'd like to know what the Housing Authority already has for their due diligence, and well, the city council can ask for that, to determine where the gaps are. So we're not going out and reinventing the wheel if you've already got the information that hasn't been presented on things like the site conditions. Because I'm imagining a great deal of that analysis has already been done. So I'd like to see it before we recommend the council go seek it out and spend taxpayer money doing it if it's there. We'll evaluate what they have, and if it's inadequate, then we go out.
I don't want to get into debate. That's one parcel, for sure.
Yeah, that's the only one I'm talking
You guys have done a
about.
lot on one parcel. That would be the home court advantage on that parcel. I was talking about the other parcels
Got it.
as well.
Okay.
So, and I do have a legal concern with the city selecting what is essentially a private developer to develop city property. I've got a constitutional problem with that. That's public assets for private gain. I think we need to ask a wider audience before the selection is made. I think that's a big mistake if we don't do that.
Bring that forward to council. Any other comments? And
I'll just reaffirm that, yeah, this isn't pre-baked at all. So I've heard on the street some people like, oh, you've already decided this. This is already going through. That is not true. That is misinformation. We are here taking this, listening to everyone's comments. I mean, you can laugh at what I say, but we are doing our due diligence, looking at all the property. Any restriction, anything like that, that's going to end up being taxpayer money, because that's our hurdle we got to get through. So we want the path of least resistance, because that will be the least costly to the taxpayer in the end. I'll just say that.
Thank you very much. And if there are no other comments amongst the committee members, I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.